When you're 58 years old and down to your last $20, pride doesn't pay the bills. Trent Halloran knew that feeling all too well when he agreed to clean out a forgotten mansion's attic for pocket change. The place had been sealed for decades, filled with trash bags that everyone assumed held nothing but worthless junk. But when one bag split open, Trent found antique war medals, coded letters, and film reels marked classified. Inside those dusty bags was evidence of a hidden Cold War outpost that had been erased from history. What he discovered would make national headlines and change his life forever. How did a desperate man's $20 side job lead to one of the most important historical finds in decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun hit Trent Halloran's windshield as he pulled his '98 Ford pickup into the gravel lot of Mabel's diner. The truck's odometer had rolled past 240,000 miles 2 years back, and the engine made a sound like a man clearing his throat every time he shifted into third gear. But it ran, and that was more than he could say for most things in his life these days. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, the same smell it had carried for 30 years. Trent slid into his usual booth by the window. The vinyl cracked and repaired with duct tape that had long since lost its stick. He didn't need to look at the menu. He ordered the same thing every morning, black coffee and a single piece of toast. Not because he particularly liked toast, but because it cost $1.50 and filled the empty space in his stomach until dinner time. Hal Pritchard was already there, occupying his corner stool at the counter like a fixture that came with the building. At 67, Hal had the posture of a man who'd spent 35 years carrying mail. Through Clement Springs, Oregon, he waved Trent over with a weathered hand that still bore the calluses of his former trade. "You look like hell," Hal said, not unkindly. "Feel worse," Trent replied, easing onto the stool beside him. His knees protested. They always did these days. 58 wasn't old, not really, but his body seemed to have missed that memo. Hal studied him over the rim of his coffee cup. "Warren, call again?" Trent shook his head. His son hadn't called in 3 weeks, not since the conversation that ended with Trent admitting he couldn't loan him money for rent. Warren was 28, still figuring things out in Portland, still angry at his father for reasons that multiplied faster than Trent could address them. Cassidy was worse. His daughter, 32 and living in Eugene, had stopped answering his calls 6 months ago. The last time they'd spoken, she'd said something about him giving up after Mom died, about him letting everything fall apart. She wasn't wrong. Maureen had been gone 5 years now. Cancer, the kind that moved fast and mean, leaving Trent shell-shocked and fumbling with a business that had already started its slow collapse. He'd owned a small carpentry operation, Halloran Custom Woodwork, back when Clement Springs still had enough construction to keep 3 crews busy. But the recession hit, then the mill closed, then people stopped building and started leaving. By the time Maureen got sick, he was down to 1 helper and doing mostly repair jobs. After she died, he couldn't seem to hold on to anything. Not the business, not the house, not his kids' respect. Now, he lived in a rental on Spruce Street, a 1-bedroom unit above a vacuum repair shop that had been closed since 2019. His entire life fit into 600 square feet and the bed of his pickup truck. "Got something for you," Hal said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "If you're interested." Trent unfolded it. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. Asterisk. "Need attic cleared. Ashford property, 1247 Ridgeline Road, $20 cash. Keep salvageables. Contact P. Kemper, Estate Services. Asterisk. $20. Trent had made $200 an hour back in the good years. He'd turned down jobs that paid less than $500. Now he was looking at a $20 cleanup job like it was a winning lottery ticket. "It's something," Hal said quietly. "And Phyllis Kemper's good people. She won't short you." Trent folded the paper and slipped it into his wallet. Right behind the photo of Maureen, he couldn't bring himself to move. The old Ashford place? That's the one. Been empty since what, late 80s? Estate's finally dealing with it. Probably a disaster up there. The Ashford mansion sat on Ridgeline Road like a monument to another era. 3 stories of Victorian architecture, painted ladies' detail work gone grey with neglect, windows broken and boarded, grounds overgrown with blackberry vines that had declared war on the wraparound porch. Trent had driven past it 1,000 times, always wondering what kind of people just walked away from a house like that. "I'll take it," Trent said. He called Phyllis Kemper from the parking lot. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the efficient warmth of someone who dealt with death and inheritance for a living. Yes, the job was still available. No, she didn't need references. Cash on completion. Keys would be in the lockbox by the front door, code 1847. Take anything he wanted from the attic except structural elements, bag the rest for dump pickup. Simple. Straightforward. $20 he didn't have yesterday. Trent spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies from the rental unit. Work gloves, dust masks, a flashlight with batteries that might or might not hold a charge, heavy-duty trash bags from the dollar store. He added a thermos of water and the ham sandwich he'd been planning to stretch across 2 meals. This would be a full day's work, maybe 2. The drive to Ridgeline Road took 15 minutes, winding up through streets that grew progressively quieter and more forgotten. The mansion loomed into view like something from a Gothic novel, all sharp angles and shadowed eaves. Up close, it looked even worse, shingles missing, gutters sagging, the kind of decay that happened when nature was given a 30-year head start. Trent retrieved the keys from the lockbox and let himself in through the front door. It opened with a sound like a sigh, decades of sealed air rushing past him into the outside world. The interior was dark. What little light remained filtered through gaps in the boards covering the windows. Dust hung in the air thick enough to taste. The staircase was solid, at least. His carpenter's eye catalogued the workmanship, even as he climbed tongue and groove construction, hand-turned balusters, joints that had held for over a century. Good bones, his father would have said. The house had good bones. The attic stairs were narrower, steeper, hidden behind a door on the 3rd-floor landing. Trent clicked on his flashlight and climbed into darkness. The attic stretched the full length of the house, a cathedral space beneath the peaked roof, and it was filled absolutely crammed with the accumulated debris of abandonment. Black trash bags formed mountains against the walls. Broken furniture lay scattered like shipwreck debris. Cardboard boxes had collapsed under their own weight, spilling contents Trent couldn't identify in the dim light. The smell was overwhelming. Mildew, dust, something organic and long deceased, probably rodents. He stood there for a long moment, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and felt the full weight of the task settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't a one-day job. This might not even be a 1-week job, and he was doing it for $20. But $20 was $20. Trent set down his supplies, pulled on his work gloves, and grabbed the first trash bag. It was surprisingly light, filled with what felt like fabric. He dragged it to the stairs and started down. By noon, he'd moved 15 bags, and his shirt was soaked through with sweat. By 2, his back was screaming, and he'd lost count. The bags all felt the same, soft, yielding, probably clothes and linens gone to ruin. Nothing worth keeping, nothing worth the effort it took to haul them down 3 flights of stairs. He was reaching for another bag when his glove caught on a tear. The plastic ripped wider, and something spilled out onto the dusty floor. Trent pointed his flashlight at it. A metal object gleamed in the beam. He bent down, ignoring his protesting knees, and picked it up carefully. It was heavy, tarnished, shaped like a star. He turned it over, and his breath caught. Silver Star Medal, the engraving read. Lieutenant Colby Ashford, valor beyond measure, 1,952. Trent stood there in the attic darkness, holding a piece of someone's History in his work-worn hands. A medal for valor. Not the kind of thing you threw in a trash bag, not the kind of thing you forgot about. He set it aside carefully and looked at what else had spilled from the torn bag. Papers, yellowed and brittle, photographs, their images faded to ghosts. A small, leather-bound book. And something else, rolls of film in metal canisters, each one labeled in neat handwriting. Property of U.S. Army Signal Corps. Trent's heart was beating faster now. This wasn't trash. This was somebody's life, somebody's service. This was something that mattered. He pulled the bag open wider and started examining the contents with new care. More documents, some with portions blacked out. Blueprints of some kind, technical drawings he didn't understand. Letters in envelopes that had never been opened. And underneath it all, more bags, just like this one, stacked and forgotten in the darkness. The $20 cleanup job had just become something else entirely. Trent sat back on his heels and stared at the torn bag like it might disappear if he looked away. The silver star caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in fragments. He picked up the medal again, felt its weight, ran his thumb over the engraved name. Preston Ashford. The same name as the house, the family that had walked away decades ago. He'd been in construction long enough to know what things were worth. Scrap metal, salvaged lumber, vintage fixtures, he could price them in his sleep. But this, a military medal, government documents, film marked as property of the U.S. Army. He had no frame of reference for any of it. The leather-bound book was a journal, he realized, opening it carefully. The binding cracked, and the pages felt like they might crumble under his fingertips. The handwriting inside was the same neat script from the film, canisters precise, controlled, the work of someone who'd been trained to document things properly. Asterisk the 14th of June, 1961. Project initialization. Complete. Equipment installation proceeding on schedule, security protocols in place. V asks too many questions. Must maintain operational security even within household. Asterisk. Trent flipped forward a few pages. Asterisk. The 3rd of August 1961. Successful intercept of transmission 447B. Forwarded to command. The isolation is harder than anticipated. Cannot discuss work with anyone, not even family. Preston Jr. asked why I'm always in the attic. Told him I'm working on a radio hobby. The lie sits heavy. Asterisk. More pages. Asterisk. The 22nd of October, 1962. Tensions escalating. Monitoring Soviet naval communications around the clock. Haven't slept in 36 hours. V is angry about my absence from dinner. I cannot tell her that what I'm doing might prevent a war. The children don't understand why their father is always locked away. Asterisk. Trent closed the journal carefully and set it aside. He was reading someone's private thoughts, their struggles and secrets. It felt invasive, but it also felt important. This Preston Ashford had been doing something classified in this house, something that involved the military and secrecy and apparently monitoring Soviet communications. During the Cold War, Trent realized, this was Cold War stuff. He looked at the torn bag, then at the dozens of others stacked in the attic darkness. How much more was here? How much history had been sitting in trash bags for 30 years? The blueprints made no sense to him, technical diagrams with annotations in shorthand he couldn't decipher. But some of the words stood out: antenna array, signal receiver, encryption protocols. This wasn't just military paperwork. This was technical documentation for some kind of communication setup. Trent pulled his phone from his pocket and took photographs. The medal first, then the journal pages, the blueprints, the film canisters. His hands were shaking slightly. He'd come here to haul trash for $20. Instead, he'd found something that felt like it belonged in a museum. He spent the next 2 hours going through bags with surgical care. Each one revealed more pieces of the puzzle, more journals spanning 1961 to 1963. Letters from someone named Vivian Ashford's wife, he assumed, complaining to her sister about Preston's secrecy and long absences. Children's drawings signed Preston Jr. and Lenora, showing stick-figure families with one figure always apart from the others. Report cards, birthday cards, the mundane documentation of a family living alongside something secret, and threaded through it all, the classified material. Reel-to-reel audio tapes labeled with dates and classified stamps, telegrams with portions blacked out in thick marker, technical manuals with confidential printed on every page, lists of personnel, security clearances, operational protocols. Trent found himself reading journal entries out of order, drawn to the personal revelations over the technical details. Asterisk, the 1st of December 1962. Crisis resolved. But at what cost? I've missed Thanksgiving, Preston Jr.'s birthday, our anniversary. V barely speaks to me. Lenora asked if I still love them. How do I explain that everything I'm doing is because I love them, because I want them to have a future? Asterisk, asterisk, the 17th of March, 1963. The work continues, but I'm losing them, my family. V mentioned separation yesterday. I cannot tell her the truth, cannot explain that this house, this attic, is part of a network that keeps our nation safe. She thinks I'm having an affair. If only it were that simple. Asterisk. Trent set down the journal and rubbed his eyes. The dust was getting to him, or maybe it was the weight of someone else's regrets. He understood that weight. He'd carried it himself for 5 years, ever since Maureen died, and he'd let everything fall apart. He'd been so buried in grief and failing business and mounting bills that he'd barely noticed his kids slipping away. By the time he looked up, Cassidy had stopped calling and Warren had stopped asking for advice. Different circumstances, same result. A man so consumed by his work, his problems, his mission, that he lost sight of what mattered most. He looked at his watch. Nearly 6 in the evening. He'd been in the attic for 8 hours and barely made a dent in the contents. But he had enough. Enough to know this wasn't simple trash disposal. Enough to know he'd stumbled onto something significant. The question was, what to do about it? The contractor in him said, finish the job, bag everything, haul it to the dump, take the $20 and move on. None of this was his business. He'd been hired to clear an attic, not preserve history. But something else in him, something that had been dormant since Maureen died, was stirring awake. This mattered. Preston Ashford's story mattered. The work he'd done, the sacrifice he'd made, the family he'd lost in the process, all of it mattered. And it was going to end up in a landfill unless someone did something. Trent gathered the metal. Several journals, the most interesting-looking documents, and carefully placed them in a separate bag. Not trash. Evidence. History. Something worth preserving. He took a final photograph of the attic, the remaining bags, the scope of what was still here, and made his way down the stairs. His truck was parked in the circular driveway, looking shabby against the mansion's faded grandeur. He loaded his tools and the special bag into the bed, covering them with a tarp. The sun was setting as he drove back down Ridgeline Road. Orange light painted the trees and made the town below look almost prosperous, almost like the Clement Springs he remembered from 20 years ago. It was an illusion, he knew. The lumber mill was still closed, the main street still half empty, the future still uncertain. But for the first time in years, Trent felt something besides resignation. He felt curious, he felt engaged, he felt like he'd been given something important to do. Back at his rental, he spread the contents of the special bag across his small kitchen table. The medal sat in the center, flanked by journals and documents. In the overhead light, everything looked even more remarkable, even more real. He tried to research online, but quickly got lost in search results that seemed to contradict each other. He didn't know enough about Cold War history to know what questions to ask. He didn't know if what he'd found was genuinely significant or just the ordinary paperwork of military life. But he knew someone who might know. Someone who could tell him if this mattered or if he was making something out of nothing. Tomorrow, he'd talk to Hal. And Hal, with his connections and his decades of knowing everyone in Clement Springs, would know what to do next. Trent sat at his table until late in the night, carefully turning pages, reading Preston Ashford's private thoughts and feeling the strangest sense of kinship with a man who'd been dead for decades. They were both fathers who'd failed their families. Both men who'd let duty or grief or stubbornness get in the way of what mattered. The difference was that Ashford hadn't gotten a chance to make it right. His story ended with regret and distance, and a family that never understood why he'd been so absent. Trent still had time. Not much maybe, but some. Enough to try. He closed the final journal and stood, his back protesting after hours in the same chair. Tomorrow he'd figure out what to do with Preston Ashford's story. Tonight he'd let himself feel something other than defeat. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Trent didn't sleep well. The journals kept running through his mind, Preston Ashford's careful handwriting, documenting a life split between duty and family. When dawn finally broke through the thin curtains of his rental, he was already awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling and thinking about coded telegrams and missed birthdays. He met Hal at Mabel's at 7, sliding into the booth across from his friend with a coffee he'd already drained halfway in the parking lot. Hal took one look at him and raised an eyebrow. "You look worse than yesterday." "Didn't sleep much." Trent pulled out his phone and scrolled to the photographs. "Need you to look at something." He passed the phone across the table. Hal squinted at the screen, swiping through images of the Silver Star, the journal pages, the classified documents. His expression shifted from curious to serious. "Where'd you get these?" "The Ashford attic. That $20 job." Trent leaned forward. "There's more. Boxes of it. Documents, recordings, technical manuals, all related to some kind of military communications project. Cold War era, I think." Hal handed back the phone slowly. "You're sitting on something here." "I know. I just don't know what." Trent wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, grateful for the warmth. "I can't just throw it away. It feels wrong. But I don't know what to do with it either." Hal was quiet for a moment, the kind of thoughtful silence that came from decades of careful consideration. "My niece teaches history at the community college. Faye Cunningham. Smart woman, specializes in Pacific Northwest history. She'd know if this is significant." "You think she'd look at it?" "I think she'd jump at it. Woman loves this stuff." Hal pulled out his phone, newer than Trent's, easier to navigate. "Let me call her." 20 minutes later it was arranged. Faye could meet them at the library that afternoon at 2. Hal had sent her a few of Trent's photographs and reported that she'd used the word extraordinary 3 times in under a minute. Trent spent the morning back at the mansion, but he worked differently now. Instead of hauling bags down the stairs, he opened them carefully in place, documenting contents with photographs, sorting items into categories. Definitely trash clothes too damaged to salvage, water-ruined books, broken household items, possibly. Valuable antiques, intact photographs, personal correspondence. And then the third category, the one that kept growing, items related to whatever Preston Ashford had been doing in this attic. He found more audio tapes, dozens of them, each labeled with dates and alphanumeric codes. He found a locked metal box about the size of a briefcase, too heavy to be empty, too sturdy to break open without tools. He found more journals, these ones with technical notes mixed in with personal observations. And he found a telegram dated the 24th of October, 1962, partially decoded in pencil in the margins, referencing something called Site Omega and a set of coordinates. The more he found, the more convinced he became that this house had been something other than a family home. The antenna array, mentioned in the blueprints, the references to monitoring Soviet transmissions, the security protocols. Preston Ashford had been running some kind of intelligence operation from his own attic. By noon, Trent had 3 bags of classified-looking materials set aside. His back ached and his lungs felt coated with decades of dust, but he felt more alive than he had in years. This was a puzzle, and he'd always been good with puzzles. Back when he ran his carpentry business, clients would bring him problems: a staircase that didn't fit, a roof angle that defied logic, and he'd work them out through patience and attention to detail. This was the same, just with higher stakes. The Clement Springs Public Library occupied a brick building on Main Street that had been new in 1967 and hadn't been updated much since. Trent arrived early, carrying a folder with printed photographs and the locked metal box he'd retrieved from the attic. Hal was already there, sitting in the small conference room with a woman Trent assumed was Faye. She stood when he entered, extending a hand. Faye Cunningham was 45, dressed in jeans and a cardigan, with reading glasses pushed up into her greying hair. Her grip was firm, and her eyes went immediately to the box under Trent's arm. "Mr. Halloran, Uncle Hal's been telling me about your discovery. Call me Trent, and I'm not sure what I've discovered, honestly. That's why I'm here." They sat, and Trent spread out the photographs across the table. Faye leaned forward, putting on her reading glasses, studying each image with the intensity of someone examining religious artifacts. She asked questions. Where exactly was this found? How many documents total? What condition are they in? And Trent answered, as best he could. When she got to the photographs of the journal entries, she went very still. "Site Omega," she said quietly, "October 1962. Do you understand what this is? Cold War something? The Cuban Missile Crisis." Faye looked up at him, her expression almost reverent. "October 1962 was the closest we've ever come to nuclear war. 13 days of tension between the US and Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. If your documents reference active monitoring during that period, if Preston Ashford was intercepting Soviet communications..." She stopped, seemed to gather herself. This could be historically significant. Trent felt something settle in his chest. Validation, maybe. Confirmation that his instinct had been right. "There's more," he said, and set the locked metal box on the table. "Found this hidden under floorboards. Haven't been able to open it." Faye reached out, but didn't touch it, as if it might be dangerous. "Do you have any idea what might be inside?" "Not a clue." "May I?" She gestured to the lock. At Trent's nod, she examined it carefully. "This is a government-issue security box. See the markings here? This would have required a key and a combination. The fact that it was hidden suggests the contents were sensitive even by the standards of a classified operation." Hal spoke up from his end of the table. "Can you open it?" Faye shook her head. "Not without damaging it, and we shouldn't risk that. But I know someone who might be able to help." She pulled out her phone and started typing notes. "There's a professor at Pacific Northwest University, Wendell Stokes. He specializes in Cold War history, specifically domestic intelligence operations. If anyone can put this in proper context, it's him." "Do you think," Trent paused, unsure how to ask, "do you think this matters, really matters, I mean? Not just to historians, but..." "I think you've found a piece of hidden history," Faye said. "There were dozens, maybe hundreds of domestic listening posts during the Cold War. Most of them were documented, but some weren't. Some were so classified that when they shut down, they were simply erased. No records, no acknowledgement, nothing. If Preston Ashford was running one of those posts from his home, and if you've found the documentation..." She gestured to the photographs. "You've found something that was deliberately hidden, something someone wanted forgotten." "But it's not my property," Trent said. "I was hired to clean the attic. Everything in that house belongs to the Ashford estate. Legally. That's complicated. Faye said. You were given salvage rights, correct? You were told you could keep anything salvageable? For a $20 cleanup job. I don't think they meant classified government documents. Faye smiled. Probably not. But here's the thing. Historical artifacts have different rules than regular property. If these documents are genuinely significant, if they represent a gap in the historical record, there's a case to be made for preservation over ownership. The estate might not even want them. They might have no idea what they had. Trent thought about that. The estate lawyer, Phyllis Kemper, had seemed focused on getting the house cleared so it could be sold. She'd never mentioned anything about the Ashford family history or what might be stored in the attic. To her, it was probably just decades of accumulated junk. What do I do? He asked. First, document everything, Faye said. Photograph every item, create an inventory, handle everything carefully. Second, let me contact Dr. Stokes. Get his professional opinion on the significance. Third, she paused. Third, we figure out the legal and ethical path forward. But Trent, I want to be clear about something. If this is what I think it is, you can't just throw it away. This is history. This is a story that deserves to be told. Trent looked at the photographs spread across the table, at the locked box sitting between them, at the hope and excitement in Faye's expression. He thought about Preston Ashford writing in his journal about missing his children's birthdays, about keeping secrets that destroyed his marriage, about doing work that mattered but cost him everything. He deserves to be remembered, Trent said quietly. Not just as someone who abandoned his family, as someone who served, who sacrificed. Even if that sacrifice was, he struggled for the right word. Even if it was complicated. Faye nodded. Then let's make sure he is. They spent another hour going through the photographs in detail. Faye explained historical context, the tensions of 1962, the technology of signals intelligence, the domestic network of listening posts that had existed in various forms throughout the Cold War. With every explanation, the scope of what Trent had found grew larger. When they finally left the library, the sun was beginning to set. Hal clapped Trent on the shoulder in the parking lot. You did good, bringing this to someone who knows. Faye'll make sure it's handled right. I just cleaned an attic, Trent said. You found history, Hal corrected. There's a difference. Driving back to his rental, Trent felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. It was heavier than he'd expected, but not unpleasant. For the first time in 5 years, he had a purpose beyond getting through the day. He had something important to do. His phone rang as he pulled into his parking space. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Dad, Cassidy's voice. His heart jumped. Cass. Hi. I saw you posted something on Facebook about a historical find. Her tone was carefully neutral, the voice of someone who'd learned not to expect much. What's that about? Trent hadn't even realized he'd posted anything. Must have been when he was figuring out how to save the photographs to his phone. But here was his daughter, calling him for the first time in 6 months. It's a long story, he said, but I'd like to tell you about it, if you have time. A pause. Then, yeah, okay, I have time. He told her about the mansion, the attic, the discovery, and for 20 minutes Cassidy listened. Over the next 3 days, Trent approached the attic like an archaeological dig. He moved slowly, methodically, treating each bag as if it might contain treasure. And increasingly, they did. He found a family photograph that stopped him cold. 5 people standing in front of the mansion, Preston Ashford in his army uniform, a woman who must have been Vivian, 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, all of them smiling. The house behind them looked pristine, the grounds manicured, the paint fresh. On the back, in faded ink, Summer 1959. Before everything changed. Before everything changed. Trent turned the photograph over again, studying the faces. Preston looked confident, proud. The children looked happy. Vivian's smile reached her eyes. This was before the classified work, before the secrecy, before the family started coming apart at the seams. He set it aside carefully and continued digging. More photographs followed, and they told a story without words. The family in 1960, the smiles a little more strained. Preston in 1961, standing apart from the others, even in the frame. By 1962, there were no more family photos at all, just individual shots, the children at school, Vivian with friends, Preston absent from the visual record entirely. The letters provided narrative to the images. Vivian writing to her sister Margaret, *, Preston is home, but he's not really here. He spends every evening locked in the attic. Says it's radio equipment for a hobby, but what kind of hobby requires this much secrecy? I'm starting to think there's another woman. What else could it be? *. Another letter, dated later. *. The children ask where their father is. I don't know what to tell them anymore. He misses dinner more nights than he makes it. Misses bedtime stories, misses school events. Preston Jr. stopped asking if Daddy would come to his baseball games. That's what hurts most, when your own child stops expecting you to show up. *. Trent had to stop reading. He recognized that hurt. Warren had stopped asking him to visit Portland. Cassidy had stopped inviting him to Sunday dinners. At some point, his children had lowered their expectations to nothing, and he'd been too buried in his own grief to notice until the silence became permanent. He pulled out his phone and looked at the last text from Warren. 3 weeks old. *. Need to borrow $300 for rent. Can you help? *. And Trent's response. *. I'm sorry. I don't have it right now. *. No response after that. Just silence. Trent put the phone away and went back to work. The children's drawings were harder to look at than the letters. A crayon picture by Lenora, showing a family at a dinner table, mother, brother, sister, and an empty chair. The title, in careful child's writing, Waiting for Daddy. Another drawing by Preston Jr., of a stick figure man behind a door with a big lock. Daddy's secret room. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence of pain, confusion, a family trying to understand why their father had disappeared, even though he still lived in the same house. On the 4th day, Trent found the technical materials that Faye had been hoping for, a complete operations manual for something called Site Omega, buried in a waterproof case that had kept its contents pristine. The manual was startlingly detailed protocols for equipment operation, codes for communication with other sites, procedures for intercepting and recording Soviet transmissions, instructions for maintaining operational security, and there was a personnel list, 12 names, each with a role and security clearance level. Preston Ashford was listed as Site Commander, top secret clearance, responsible for overall operations and liaison with naval intelligence. Trent photographed every page, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was documenting. This wasn't speculation anymore. This was proof. The Ashford mansion had housed a classified intelligence operation during the Cold War, and Preston Ashford had been in charge of it. He called Faye immediately. She arrived within an hour, bringing Dr. Wendell Stokes with her. Stokes was 61, professorial in the way people expected professors to. Be tweed jacket despite the warm weather, wire-rimmed glasses, an intensity that made him seem younger than his years. He took one look at the operations manual and actually gasped. "Where did you find this?" "Waterproof case, tucked behind the chimney breast." Trent gestured to the attic space around them. "There's more. Audio tapes, transcripts, technical diagrams. It's all here." Stokes spent 2 hours examining materials, while Trent and Faye watched. He moved carefully, almost reverently, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. When he finally looked up, his expression was awestruck. "This is remarkable. Site Omega was rumored to exist, but there was never any documentation. The Navy denied it, said the listening posts were all in Alaska and along the coast. But here, he gestured to the manual, here's proof of a domestic station operating from a civilian residence, completely off the official record. Why would they do that? Trent asked. Why hide it in a house instead of using a military base? Plausible deniability, Stokes said. If the Soviets found out we were monitoring their communications from within the continental US, it could have been seen as an escalation. But a house on Ridgeline Road? Just some army officer doing radio hobby work? It's camouflage. It destroyed his family, Trent said quietly. He showed Stokes the letters, the photographs, the children's drawings. He couldn't tell them what he was doing. Couldn't explain why he was always locked in the attic, why he missed everything important. So they thought he didn't care. Stokes studied the family photograph from 1959, the one marked before everything changed. His expression softened. The Cold War asked for sacrifices that were never acknowledged, he said. Men and women who did classified work, who couldn't tell their families, who bore the weight of secrecy alone. History remembers the public figures, the politicians and generals, but people like Preston Ashford, he shook his head. They served in silence and died in silence, and their families never knew why. We can change that, Faye said. We can tell his story. It's not my story to tell, Trent said. I was hired to clean an attic. This belongs to the Ashford family. Stokes set down the photograph carefully. Do you know if the family is still alive? Any descendants? The estate lawyer mentioned that the property's been in probate for years, something about distant heirs who couldn't agree on what to do with it. I don't know more than that. We need to find them, Faye said. Preston's children, if they're still alive, they deserve to know what their father was doing. They deserve to understand. Trent thought about that. Lenora and Preston Jr., who'd drawn pictures of empty chairs and locked doors. They'd be in their 60s now, maybe with children and grandchildren of their own, maybe still carrying the hurt of a father who'd seemed to choose work over family, never knowing that the work had been genuinely important, genuinely necessary. I'll help find them, he said, but we should do this right, legally, ethically. I don't want to ambush anyone with information about their father. Over the next week, research consumed Trent's time. Faye worked on historical context, while Stokes prepared documentation for academic publication. Trent hired a probate attorney named Grady Fulton, who came recommended by Hal and worked at a rate Trent could almost afford now that the Ashford estate had paid him for a week's work instead of just a day. Grady's research revealed that Preston Ashford had died in 1968 of a heart attack, only 49 years old. Vivian had moved to California with the children shortly after, never returning to Oregon. She died in 1995. But the children were still alive. Lenora in Seattle, Preston Jr. in Sacramento. I should call them, Trent said. Before this goes any further, they should know. Are you sure? You want to be the one to do that? Grady asked. I could make the contact. Or Faye, from an academic perspective. But Trent shook his head. I found their father's story. I read his journals, saw his regrets, understood what he sacrificed. It should come from me. That evening, alone in his rental with Preston Ashford's journals spread across his kitchen table, Trent dialed the Seattle number Grady had provided. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. Hello? Is this Lenora Ashford? A pause. Yes. Who's calling? My name is Trent Halloran. This is going to sound strange, but I've been cleaning out your father's house in Clement Springs, and I found something I think you should know about. Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, guarded. My father's been dead for almost 60 years. What could you possibly have found? Trent took a breath. Evidence that he was a hero, that everything he did, all the times he was absent, all the secrecy it was, because he was serving his country in ways he couldn't explain. And I think it's time you knew the truth about him. The silence that followed was so long Trent thought she'd hung up. Then he heard something that might have been a sob, or a laugh, or both. Tell me, Lenora said. "Please, tell me everything." And so he did. The weekend newspaper hit doorsteps across Clement Springs with a front-page headline that made people stop and stare. Local handyman uncovers Cold War secret. Irma Colfax, the editor of the Clement Springs Courier, had done her homework. The article featured photographs of the Silver Star Medal, excerpts from Preston Ashford's journals, and a sidebar explaining Site Omega's role in domestic intelligence operations. Trent's phone started ringing before he'd finished his morning coffee. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years wanted to know more. Former clients from his carpentry days called to congratulate him. Even the mayor left a voicemail about the potential for historical tourism. But Monday morning brought visitors he hadn't expected. Two people in dark suits appeared at his door at 8 sharp. The woman was 41, with short, dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. The man was older, maybe 47, with the bearing of someone who'd spent time in the military. They showed him credentials that identified them as Special Agents Corinne Yates and Lloyd Brennan from the Department of Energy, Office of Classification Review. "Mr. Halloran," Yates said, "we need to talk about what you found in the Ashford mansion." Trent's first instinct was panic, the kind that comes when authority figures show up unannounced. But he pushed it down and invited them inside, immediately calling Grady Fulton. The attorney arrived within 30 minutes, still wearing his running shoes from his morning jog. They sat in Trent's small living room, the government agents on one side, Trent and Grady on the other. Yates did most of the talking. "We understand you've discovered documents related to a classified intelligence operation," she said. "Some of those documents may still fall under national security protections." "The Cold War ended 30 years ago," Grady said. "Surely there's an automatic declassification timeline. For most materials." "Yes," Brennan spoke for the first time. "But certain categories of intelligence sources, methods, technical capabilities, those can remain classified indefinitely. We need to review what Mr. Halloran found to determine classification status." "I've been cooperative," Trent said. "I contacted historians, worked with academics. I'm not trying to compromise national security. I'm trying to honor a man who served his country." Yates's expression softened slightly. "We understand that, and we appreciate your cooperation. But we have a responsibility to review the materials. May we see them?" Trent looked at Grady, who nodded. They spent the next 2 hours going through everything Trent had collected. The agents photographed documents, took notes, occasionally conferring in low voices. When they got to the locked metal box, the one Trent still hadn't managed to open, Yates pulled out a set of lockpicks and had it open in under 3 minutes. Inside were documents that made both agents go very still. "What is it?" Trent asked. Yates looked up at him, her expression carefully neutral. "Intelligence reports, specifically intercepted Soviet submarine communications from October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis," Brennan added. "This is Mr. Halloran. Do you understand what you've found here?" Trent shook his head, feeling suddenly out of his depth. Brennan pulled out one of the documents, a transcript of a decoded transmission. "During the crisis, one of our biggest concerns was Soviet submarine movements. We knew they had subs in the Atlantic, some of them carrying nuclear torpedoes. If we'd lost track of them, if they'd gotten close enough to launch." He didn't finish the sentence. "Site Omega intercepted submarine communication patterns, helped naval intelligence track their positions. So Preston Ashford's work may have helped prevent a nuclear confrontation," Yates said. "We'll need to verify this through official channels, cross-reference with declassified naval records. But if these documents are authentic, and preliminary assessment suggests they are, then yes, the intelligence gathered at Site Omega was operationally significant." The room went quiet. Trent thought about Preston Ashford sitting in his attic night after night, missing dinners and birthdays, losing his family one silence at a time. And all along, he'd been doing work that might have helped save the world. "What happens now?" Grady asked. "We need to take these materials for official review," Yates said. "The process typically takes 60 to 90 days. We'll determine what can be declassified and what needs to remain protected. Mr. Halloran will retain ownership of declassified materials, and the rest will be properly archived in secure facilities." Yates looked at Trent directly. "But here's what I can tell you. The historical narrative, the story of Site Omega, Preston Ashford's service, the personal sacrifice that can be released. The technical details of exactly how intercepts were conducted, the specific encryption methods, some operational protocols, those need to remain classified. But the important part, the part that honors this man's service, that can be told." Over the next 3 weeks, Trent's life transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined. Dr. Stokes fast-tracked his academic paper, working with the Classification Review Office to ensure everything included was approved for release. News of the discovery spread beyond Clement Springs. Regional papers picked it up, then state news, then national outlets. A producer from a documentary series called Wanting to Option the Story. A literary agent reached out about a book deal. The National Archives expressed interest in the Preston Ashford collection, as it was now being called. But the most important development came in the form of a phone call from Lenora Ashford. "I'm coming to Oregon," she said. "I need to see the house. I need to see where my father worked, what he left behind. And I need to meet you." They arranged to meet at the mansion on a Saturday morning. Trent arrived early, nervous in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd told this woman her father was a hero, given her a new understanding of the man she'd thought abandoned her. What if seeing the actual place, the attic where Preston had spent so many absent hours, made it worse instead of better? Lenora arrived in a rental car, a tall woman with her father's careful posture and her mother's sad eyes. She was 68, but carried herself like someone younger, or maybe just someone who'd learned not to let age slow her down. She stood in the circular driveway for a long moment, staring up at the mansion. "I haven't been here since I was 12 years old," she said. "Mum packed us up in 1964, said we were moving to California for a fresh start. I asked if Dad was coming with us. She said, maybe later. He never did." Trent led her inside, up the stairs, to the attic. Someone, probably the estate, had installed better lighting since he'd started working here, but the space still felt haunted by its history. Lenora stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. "This is where he was," she said. "All those nights we sat at dinner without him, all those school plays he missed. Every Christmas morning when he was too busy to come downstairs, he was here. Doing work that mattered," Trent said quietly. "Work that he couldn't explain, couldn't share. But it mattered, Lenora. What he did here might have saved lives, might have prevented a war." She nodded, tears running down her face. "I know. You've told me that. Dr. Stokes confirmed it. The government agents verified it. I know my father was a hero. But," her voice broke, "but I wish he could have been both, a hero and a father. Why did it have to be one or the other?" Trent didn't have an answer for that. He thought about Maureen's illness, how he'd been so consumed with saving a failing business that he'd missed her final months really being present. How, after she died, he'd been so buried in grief that he'd let his relationships with Cassidy and Warren wither. He'd had no classified mission, no noble cause, just ordinary failure and ordinary absence. "I found something," he said. "Something I saved for you." He pulled out an envelope he'd discovered in the final sweep of the attic, hidden in the lining of an old suitcase. On the front, in Preston Ashford's handwriting, "To Lenora and Preston Jr. open when you're ready to understand." Lenora took it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, several pages long, dated 1964. She read it silently, and Trent watched her expression shift from pain to understanding to something like peace. When she finished, she handed it to Trent. "Read it," she said. "You should know." The letter was an apology and an explanation. Preston Ashford, writing to the children he'd lost, trying to explain what he'd been doing and why. He couldn't give specifics. The letter was carefully worded to avoid classified details, but he conveyed the weight of the responsibility, the importance of the mission, the impossibility of choosing between duty and family when both demanded everything. The final paragraph was the hardest to read. Asterisk, "I know I've failed you as a father. I know that years from now, if you remember me at all, it will be as the man who was never there. I wish I could tell you why. I wish I could make you understand that every moment I spent away from you was spent trying to keep you safe, to ensure you'd have a future. But I can't tell you, and you won't understand, and I'll die knowing that my service cost me the only things that really mattered. If somehow, someday, the truth comes out, know that I loved you. Every absent dinner, every missed birthday, every time I chose the attic over the dinner table, it was never because you didn't matter. You mattered more than anything. That's why the work mattered too." Asterisk, Trent folded the letter carefully and handed it back. Lenora held it against her chest like something precious. "I forgive him," she said. "I thought I never would, but I do. I forgive him." 6 weeks after the initial discovery, preparations for the press conference consumed everyone's time. The National Archives had sent a preservation team to catalogue and carefully transport the materials. Dr. Stokes had finished his academic paper, which had been accepted for expedited publication in the Journal of Cold War Studies, and Pacific Northwest University had agreed to host a public announcement coordinated with the official declassification. Trent's life had changed in ways both practical and profound. The university had paid him a consulting fee for the materials, enough to cover 3 months of rent and fix the transmission on his truck. A few media outlets had paid for interviews, but more important than the money was the sense of purpose that had returned to his days. He was standing in his rental bathroom, trying to knot a borrowed tie, when his phone rang. "Cassidy. Hey, Dad, just confirming the press conference is tomorrow at 2? "That's right." He gave up on the tie and left it hanging loose. "You're still coming? I wouldn't miss it." There was warmth in her voice that had been absent for years. "This is incredible, what you've done. Mom would be proud." The words hit him harder than expected. He sat down on the edge of the bathtub, phone pressed to his ear. "You think so?" "I know so. She always said you had a good heart, that you just got lost for a while after everything fell apart." Cassidy paused. "I think maybe you're finding your way back." They talked for another 20 minutes, the longest conversation they'd had in years. She told him about her job at the library in Eugene, her apartment, her life. He told her about working with Dr. Stokes and Faye, about meeting Lenora Ashford, about how strange it felt to be at the center of something important. "Warren's coming too," Cassidy said as they were wrapping up. "He didn't want to tell you in case something came up with work, but he bought a plane ticket. He'll be there." Trent had to clear his throat before he could respond. "Both of you? Together?" "Both of us. Together." He could hear the smile in her voice. "Turns out our dad did something worth showing up for." After they hung up, Trent sat in the small bathroom for a long time, looking at his reflection in the mirror above the sink. The same weathered face, the same tired eyes. But something had shifted. He looked like a man who had something to live for again. That evening, Hal came by with a suit that fit better than the one Trent had been planning to wear. "Belonged to my son before he moved to Denver," Hal said. "You're about the same build. Might as well put it to use." They sat in Trent's kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone cold, talking about the journey from that first $20 job to tomorrow's press conference. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd just thrown it all away?" Hal asked. "If you'd treated it like trash and never looked twice?" "All the time," Trent admitted. Preston Ashford's story would have ended up in a landfill. His kids would never have known the truth. History would have lost another piece of itself. But you didn't throw it away. You saw something worth saving. Trent thought about that. Maybe I just recognized someone else who'd messed up their family life and wanted to help set the record straight, even if it was 60 years too late. Hal nodded. Slowly. You're being too hard on yourself. Again, probably. Trent stood and refilled their coffee cups, this time with fresh brew. Cassidy and Warren are coming tomorrow. Both of them. That's good. That's real good, Trent. I don't know if one press conference fixes everything that's broken between us, but it's something. It's a start. The morning of the press conference arrived grey and cold, typical Oregon autumn weather. Trent drove to the university with Hal, both of them silent with nerves. The auditorium was already filling when they arrived, reporters with cameras and notepads, academics with serious expressions, community members from Clement Springs who'd driven 2 hours to be there. Backstage, controlled chaos reigned. Dr. Stokes was reviewing his presentation slides one final time. Faye was coordinating with the university's media relations team, and Lenora Ashford stood quietly in a corner, holding a small wooden box that Trent knew contained her father's silver star medal. You ready for this? Trent asked her. She smiled, though her hands were shaking slightly. I've waited 60 years to understand my father. I'm ready. Cassidy found him 20 minutes before they were scheduled to begin. She looked professional in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back, and for a moment Trent saw Maureen in her face, the same determined set of her jaw, the same kind eyes. Dad. She hugged him, and he held on maybe a second longer than necessary. You look nervous. Terrified, he admitted. You'll do great. Just tell the truth. Tell Preston Ashford's story the way you told it to me on the phone that first night. That's all anyone needs to hear. Warren arrived just as they were being called to take their seats. He was 28 but looked younger, still carrying the uncertain posture of someone who hadn't quite figured out who he was supposed to be. He shook Trent's hand awkwardly, then seemed to reconsider and pulled him into a brief hug. This is pretty cool, Dad. What you did? I just cleaned an attic, Trent said. You did more than that. Warren gestured to the filling auditorium. All these people are here because you recognize something important and refuse to throw it away. That takes, I don't know, character, I guess. The university president opened the press conference with remarks about historical preservation and academic responsibility. Then Dr. Stokes took the stage, presenting his findings with the enthusiasm of someone who devoted his life to uncovering hidden history. He explained Site Omega's role in domestic intelligence operations, the network of listening posts that had existed during the Cold War, the significance of having documentation that had been deliberately hidden from the historical record. He showed photographs of the mansion, blueprints of the antenna array, excerpts from Preston Ashford's operational logs. The audience was rapt, the journalists taking notes frantically, the academics nodding with recognition and approval. Then it was Trent's turn. He walked to the podium on legs that felt unsteady, faced a room full of strangers and a few familiar faces in the front row. Cassidy and Warren sitting together, Hal beaming with pride, Faye giving him an encouraging nod. His prepared remarks were in his pocket, 3 pages of carefully written notes. But when he opened his mouth, he didn't reach for them. My name is Trent Halloran, he said, and 6 weeks ago, I was a 58-year-old handyman who took a $20 job cleaning out an attic because I needed $20. A ripple of sympathetic laughter ran through the audience. I wasn't looking for history. I wasn't looking for meaning or purpose or redemption. I was just trying to get through another day, same as I'd been doing for the past 5 years since my wife died and my life fell apart. He could see Cassidy wiping her eyes in the front row. But when I found Preston Ashford's Silver Star medal in a trash bag, something stopped me from throwing it away. Maybe it was respect for a fellow veteran. Maybe it was recognition of my own failures reflected in his journals. Maybe I just got lucky. He paused. Preston Ashford was a man who sacrificed his family for duty. Who missed birthdays and dinners and school plays because he was doing classified work that he couldn't explain to anyone, not even the people he loved most? His children grew up thinking he didn't care about them. His wife left him because she thought he was keeping secrets out of cruelty rather than necessity. Trent looked at Lenora, who nodded for him to continue. But the truth is that Preston Ashford spent those nights in the attic intercepting Soviet communications during one of the most dangerous periods in human history. The work he did at Site Omega helped track submarine movements during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His intelligence might have helped prevent nuclear war. He was a hero, but he died without his family ever knowing why he'd been so absent. The room was completely silent now. I can't give Preston Ashford back the years he lost with his children. I can't repair his marriage or undo the pain his secrecy caused. But I can tell his story. I can make sure that history remembers him not as a man who abandoned his family, but as a man who served his country in silence and paid a terrible price for that service. He gestured to Lenora. Preston's daughter is here today, and she's about to receive something her father earned but she never knew existed. Lenora joined him at the podium, the wooden box in her hands. Trent opened it to reveal not just the Silver Star, but something else, a Medal of Commendation that the Classification Review team had discovered in Navy archives, issued posthumously in 1969 for Ashford's service during the Cuban crisis. The medal had been classified and never presented to the family. Until now. Lieutenant Colonel Preston Ashford, Trent said formally, served his country with distinction and honor. His daughter Lenora accepts these medals on his behalf and on behalf of all the families who sacrificed without knowing why. The auditorium erupted in applause. People stood, the sound building and building. Lenora was crying openly, holding the medals against her chest. And Trent, looking out at the crowd, at his children in the front row standing and clapping, felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt like he'd done something that mattered. The press conference continued with questions from journalists, but Trent barely heard them. His part was done, and Dr. Stokes handled the technical inquiries with ease. What mattered was the moment after, when he stepped off the stage and found both his children waiting for him. Warren spoke first. "That was Dad, that was really something." Cassidy just hugged him, tight and long. When she pulled back, her mascara was smudged from crying. "You honored him, Preston Ashford, I mean. You gave him back his dignity." "He earned it," Trent said. "I just found the evidence." But that wasn't entirely true, and he knew it. Finding the materials was one thing. Recognizing their significance, refusing to throw them away, investing weeks of unpaid work to ensure the story was told properly, that had been his choice, his contribution. The reception afterward was held in the university's faculty lounge, a space with wood paneling and the smell of old books. Reporters approached Trent with follow-up questions. Academics wanted to discuss the implications for Cold War historical research. But the most meaningful conversation happened in a quiet corner with Lenora Ashford. She was holding both medals now, her father's Silver Star from 1952, and the Medal of Commendation from 1969 that she'd never known existed. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a wristwatch, old and well-worn, the leather band cracked with age. "This was my father's. He wore it every day, even toward the end. After he died, my mother packed it away with his other belongings. She gave it to me years later, said I should have something that mattered to him." Trent started to protest, but Lenora pressed it into his hands. "You gave me my father back," she said. "Not the man who was there, he's still gone, and I've made peace with that. But you gave me understanding. You showed me that his absence wasn't indifference. That matters more than you know." The watch was heavier than Trent expected. He turned it over and saw an inscription on the back, *PA. Time spent in service of what matters most. "I can't take this," he said. "You already have." Lenora smiled through fresh tears. "Besides, you'll need it. You're going to be busy from here on out. Documentary interviews, the book deal, consulting with the National Archives. My father's story isn't finished being told, it's just beginning. She was right, though Trent hadn't fully processed it yet. A producer named Glenda Whitmore had approached him during the reception, talking about a 3-part documentary series. A publisher's representative had left a business card with a number to call. The Clement Springs Historical Society wanted to create a permanent exhibit at the library. Preston Ashford's story was spreading beyond this auditorium, beyond this university, beyond Oregon. It was becoming part of the larger conversation about sacrifice and secrecy, about the human cost of national security, about families torn apart by duty. And somehow, improbably, Trent Halloran was at the center of it. Dr. Stokes found him as the reception was winding down. "There's one more thing," he said. "We kept it quiet until now, but the university wants to establish the Preston Ashford Memorial Fund for Cold War historical preservation. We'd like you to serve on the advisory board." "Me? I'm not a historian. I'm a carpenter who cleaned an attic." "You're the man who recognized that." "History matters," Stokes corrected. "That stories deserve to be told, especially when they've been deliberately hidden. That's exactly the perspective we need." Trent looked around the room at the assembled academics, journalists, and community members. 6 weeks ago, he'd been invisible, another middle-aged man struggling to keep his head above water. Now, people wanted his opinion, his participation, his story. It was overwhelming. But it was also proof that lives could change, that purpose could be found in unexpected places, that it was never too late to matter again. The real climax came that evening, after the press conference had ended and the crowds had dispersed. Cassidy had suggested dinner, just the 3 of them, Trent and his 2 children, at a small Italian restaurant near the university. It was the first time they'd all sat down together in over 3 years. They ordered too much food and talked about everything except the press conference at first. Cassidy told stories about difficult library patrons. Warren talked about his job in Portland, working IT support for a medical supply company. Safe topics, comfortable ground. But eventually, over shared tiramisu and coffee that had gone lukewarm, the conversation shifted. "I was angry at you for a long time," Cassidy said, not looking at Trent directly. "After Mum died, the way you just shut down, stopped returning calls, stopped showing up for things. It felt like you decided to check out of life, and Warren and I were just casualties of that decision." Trent set down his fork carefully. "You weren't wrong to be angry. I know I wasn't wrong. But..." She finally met his eyes. "Today, hearing you talk about Preston Ashford, about how he lost his family even though he was trying to protect them, trying to serve something bigger, I understood something I hadn't before." "What's that?" "That sometimes people get lost, not because they don't care, but because they're overwhelmed, or grieving, or scared. Dad, you got lost after Mum died. You stopped being present because being present hurt too much. And we, Warren and I, we were hurt by that, but we also could have tried harder to pull you back." Warren nodded. "I was angry too. Still am, sometimes. But I'm also old enough now to understand that adults are just people. They mess up, they fail, they get things wrong." He pushed crumbs around his plate. "You got things wrong, Dad. But you're trying to get them right again. That's what matters." Trent felt his throat tighten. "I don't know if one discovery fixes 5 years of being absent." "It doesn't," Cassidy said. "But it's not about the discovery. It's about you showing up today. About you showing up for Preston Ashford's story, for Lenora, for all those weeks of work you did because you thought it mattered. You're showing up again. That's what we needed to see." "I want to do better," Trent said. "With both of you. I want to be present, too. Be involved in your lives. Not because I found something important in an attic, but because you're my children and I love you, and I've wasted too much time already." "Then do better," Warren said simply. "Starting now, starting with this dinner, and the next one, and the one after that, "Show up, Dad. That's all we're asking." They talked until the restaurant staff started stacking chairs on empty tables. They made plans. Cassidy would visit Clement Springs in 2 weeks. Warren would come for Thanksgiving. They'd start a regular phone schedule. Small steps, but deliberate ones. When they finally left, stepping out into the cold autumn night, Cassidy linked her arm through Trent's. Warren walked on his other side, and for the first time in years, Trent felt like he had a family again. The drive back to Clement Springs took 2 hours. Hal had left earlier with Faye, giving Trent space to spend time with his children. Now, alone in his truck with the heater rattling and the radio, playing soft jazz, Trent had time to process everything that had happened. The press conference had been a success beyond anything he'd imagined. Preston Ashford's story was out in the world now, being discussed and debated and remembered. Lenora had closure. The historical record had been corrected. And somehow, in the process of honoring a dead man's service, Trent had found a path back to his own life. He pulled into the parking lot of his rental just after midnight. The vacuum repair shop below his apartment was dark, the street quiet. He sat in the truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, looking up at his small window with its thin curtains and single lamp. It wasn't much, but it was home. And tomorrow, when he woke up, he'd have purpose again. Projects to work on, people who wanted his time and expertise, children who were willing to give him another chance. Preston Ashford's watch was still in his pocket. Trent pulled it out and looked at the inscription again. Asterisk, time spent in service of what matters most. Asterisk, Preston had spent his time serving his country, and it had cost him his family. Trent had spent 5 years serving nothing but his own grief, and it had cost him the same. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still time to serve what mattered most, his relationships, his children, the connections that gave life meaning. He fastened the watch around his wrist. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Inside his apartment, Trent made chamomile tea and sat at his small kitchen table. The same table where he'd first examined Preston Ashford's journals, where he'd made the decision not to throw history away. Everything had started here, in this cramped space, with a choice to care about something beyond his own survival. He pulled out a notebook new, bought specifically for this purpose, and began to write. Not for publication, not for anyone else. Just for himself, and maybe someday for his grandchildren. If Cassidy or Warren ever had kids, he wrote about the $20 job that changed his life, about finding meaning in an abandoned attic. About the parallels between his failures and Preston Ashford's sacrifices, about the long road back to connection with his children, and he wrote about hope, how it could appear in the most unexpected places, wrapped in dust and darkness, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to look. Outside, Clement Springs slept, but inside this small apartment, Trent Halloran was wide awake, writing his own story for the first time in years. The days following the press conference brought a media storm that Trent hadn't anticipated. His phone rang constantly, news outlets requesting interviews, documentary producers pitching concepts, publishers offering book deals. The story of the handyman who discovered a Cold War secret had captured something in the national imagination, a feel-good narrative in a world that seemed short on them. But Trent found himself most interested in the quieter responses. Letters arrived at the Clement Springs post office, forwarded from the university. Veterans writing to share their own stories of classified service. Adult children of Cold War intelligence workers asking if he'd found anything about their parents. Historians wanting access to the materials for research. Each letter represented a story, a life touched by secrecy and sacrifice. Trent read them all, usually late at night in his rental apartment, feeling the weight of responsibility settling deeper onto his shoulders. Faye helped him organize responses, setting up a dedicated email address and creating a system for cataloging inquiries. Dr. Stokes worked with the National Archives to establish protocols for researchers who wanted to examine the Preston Ashford collection. And Lenora Ashford became an unexpected partner, helping to field media requests and providing family context that enriched the story. 2 weeks after the press conference, Trent received a package with no return address. Inside was a small photograph, black and white, showing a group of men in civilian clothes standing in front of what appeared to be radio equipment. On the back, someone had written, "Site Omega Crew, 1962. My father is second from left. Thank you for remembering them." Trent studied the photograph for a long time. One of these men was Preston Ashford, though he couldn't tell which one without consulting other images. But they all had the same look, serious, focused, carrying the weight of secrets they couldn't share. He added the photograph to the growing archive, making a note about its anonymous arrival. This was what mattered, he realized. Not the media attention, or the book deals, or the documentary. This, the slow accumulation of memory, the preservation of stories that had been deliberately hidden, the honoring of service that had gone unacknowledged for decades. The Ashford Mansion project was moving forward faster than expected. A matching grant from the State Historical Preservation Fund, combined with private donations inspired by Preston's story, had provided enough capital to begin serious restoration work. The roof was being replaced, the windows repaired, the foundation stabilized. Trent walked through the house with the lead contractor, a woman named Iris Talbot, who specialized in historic properties. She pointed out details he'd never noticed. Original crown molding hidden under decades of paint, hardwood floors buried beneath water-damaged carpet, a hand-painted frieze in the dining room that had been covered by wallpaper. "This house has good bones," Iris said, echoing what Trent's father used to say about quality construction. "Whoever built it knew what they were doing. It's worth saving." In the attic, they discussed plans to preserve the space, as it had been during Site Omega's operation. Display cases would hold some of the original equipment, a radio receiver that had been found in storage, the desk where Preston had worked, some of the technical manuals. The rest of the attic would be restored to its 1962 appearance, giving visitors a sense of what the listening post had looked like. "People need to see it," Trent said. "Need to understand that intelligence work wasn't just about concrete bunkers and government facilities. Sometimes it was a man in his attic, night after night, doing work he couldn't tell anyone about." Iris nodded. "We'll make sure they understand. This will be one of the most significant Cold War historic sites in the Pacific Northwest." That evening, Trent had dinner with Hal at Mabel's diner. The place had become something of a pilgrimage site for people interested in Preston Ashford's story. The booth where Trent and Hal had first discussed the discovery had a small plaque now, installed by Mabel herself over Trent's protests. "You're famous," Hal said, gesturing to the plaque. "Local hero." "I cleaned an attic," Trent replied, the same response he'd been giving for weeks. "You did more than that, and you know it." Hal sipped his coffee. "Question is, what are you going to do with it? The fame, the attention, the opportunities?" Trent had been thinking about that. Preston Ashford Jr.'s offer to direct the memorial fund was still on the table. The book deal would require significant time and effort. The documentary producers wanted him as a consultant, and there were inquiries about speaking engagements, consulting work with other historical preservation projects, even a teaching position at the community college. "I don't want to lose myself in it," he said finally. "The way I lost myself in grief after Maureen died. I want to do meaningful work, but I also want to be present for Cassidy and Warren. Want to have a life beyond this discovery." "That's wise," Hal said. Preston Ashford's tragedy was letting his work consume everything else. "You don't have to repeat that mistake." "No," Trent agreed. "I don't." His phone buzzed with a text from Cassidy. "Asterisk, can you video call in 20 minutes? Want to show you something." Asterisk. He excused himself from dinner and drove back to his apartment. 20 minutes later, he was staring at his daughter's face on his phone screen, and she was beaming. "I have news," she said. "I've been offered a position as the head archivist at the Oregon Historical Society in Portland. Better pay, more responsibility. And Dad, they specifically mentioned that my connection to the Preston Ashford discovery made me a more attractive candidate." Trent felt a surge of pride. "That's wonderful, Cass, really wonderful. It means I'll be closer. Portland's only 2 hours from Clement Springs instead of 3 from Eugene. We can see each other more often." She paused. "If you want that." "I want that," he said. "More than you know." They talked for another hour, Cassidy sharing details about the new position, asking his advice about the move, discussing plans for Thanksgiving. It was the kind of easy, flowing conversation they used to have before Maureen died, before everything fell apart. After they hung up, Trent sat in his kitchen and felt the full weight of what had changed. 3 months ago, his children barely spoke to him. Now Cassidy was planning her life with the assumption that he'd be part of it. Now Warren was talking about visiting for the holidays. Now he had a family again, not the one he'd lost, but one that was being rebuilt from the pieces that remained. Preston Ashford's watch ticked steadily on his wrist. The inscription times, time spent in service of what matters most times, felt like both a reminder and a warning. Preston had spent his time serving his country and lost his family. Trent had the chance to serve both, to honor history through the Memorial Fund and Restoration Project, while also being present for the people who mattered most. It was a balancing act, but one he was determined to master. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A government sedan pulled up outside Trent's apartment, and Special Agent Corinne Yates emerged. She'd shed the formal suit for jeans and a jacket, looking less intimidating than during their first meeting. "Mr. Halloran, do you have a few minutes?" They sat in his small living room, and Yates pulled out a folder. "The classification review is complete. Almost everything you found can be released to the public. There are a few technical documents that need to remain classified, but they're being transferred to the National Archives for secure storage." "That's good news," Trent said. "There's more." Yates opened the folder. "During our review, we discovered something. Preston Ashford wasn't just running Site Omega. He was instrumental in developing the protocols that all the domestic listening posts used. His reports influenced national policy, and the intelligence he provided during the Cuban Missile Crisis." She paused. "It's been confirmed. His intercepts of Soviet submarine communications were forwarded to Naval Command and contributed to the decision-making that helped resolve the crisis peacefully." Trent absorbed that. So he really did help prevent a war. He did, and the Department of Energy, in coordination with the Department of Defense, has decided to formally acknowledge his service. There will be an official ceremony at the Pentagon in January. His children are invited, obviously. But we'd like you to be there as well. You're the reason his story came to light. That deserves recognition." After Yates left, Trent sat quietly for a long time. The Pentagon. Official recognition. Preston Ashford's name would be added to the public record of those who served during the Cold War, his sacrifice finally acknowledged decades after his death. It was everything he'd hoped for when he decided not to throw away that first trash bag. It was justice, delayed but delivered, and it was just the beginning. January arrived cold and clear, the kind of winter weather that made Oregon feel like a different planet from Washington, D.C. Trent had never been to the nation's capital before. The closest he'd come was watching it on television during inaugurations and state funerals. Now he was standing in a hotel room 3 blocks from the Pentagon, adjusting a tie he'd bought specifically for this occasion, trying to calm nerves that felt like live wires under his skin. Cassidy knocked on the connecting door between their rooms. She'd flown out with him, taking time off from her new position to be there. Warren had wanted to come but couldn't get away from work, a disappointment, but one softened by the fact that he'd called the night before just to say he was proud of his father. "You look good, Dad," Cassidy said. "Professional." I look terrified, Trent corrected, but he smiled. They met Lenora and Preston Jr. in the hotel lobby. Lenora wore a navy dress with her father's medals pinned carefully to the fabric, the Silver Star and the Medal of Commendation, both gleaming against the dark cloth. Preston Jr. was in a full suit, carrying a leather portfolio that contained photographs and documents from his father's service. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock in one of the Pentagon's formal halls. A government car picked them up at 9. The driver silent and professional as he navigated through security checkpoints and into the massive complex. Inside, the Pentagon was everything Trent had imagined, and nothing like he'd expected. Endless corridors, purposeful people moving with military efficiency, the weight of history and power in every marble surface and official portrait. They were escorted to a waiting room where coffee and pastries had been laid out, though no one felt like eating. Special Agent Yates appeared at 9:30. "They're ready for you." The ceremonial hall was smaller than Trent had expected, but more impressive: wood paneling, flags, representing every branch of service, a raised platform with a podium bearing the Department of Defense seal. About 50 people were already seated: military officials in dress uniforms, civilian administrators in dark suits, a handful of reporters with cameras and notepads. Trent, Cassidy, Lenora, and Preston Jr. were seated in the front row. Dr. Stokes was there too, having flown out at his own expense to witness the moment. Faye had sent her regrets, but made Trent promise to take detailed notes. At precisely 10 o'clock, a Rear Admiral named Clarence Winters stepped to the podium. He was in his 60s, ramrod straight, with a chest full of ribbons and the bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in service. "Ladies and gentlemen," Winters began, "we are here today to correct an historical oversight and to honor a man whose service to this nation went unrecognized for far too long." He spoke about the Cold War, about the domestic intelligence network that had operated in secrecy, about the men and women who'd served without acknowledgement or public appreciation. He explained Site Omega's role in the larger framework of signals intelligence, the critical nature of submarine tracking during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the courage it took to serve in silence. Lieutenant Colonel Preston Ashford, Winters said, exemplified the quiet heroism that defined an entire generation of intelligence professionals. He served not on battlefields, but in an attic. He fought not with weapons, but with radio receivers and encryption protocols. And he sacrificed not his life, though the stress of his service likely contributed to his early death, but his relationship with his family, the most profound sacrifice any person can make. Lenora was crying silently beside Trent. Preston Jr. sat rigid, jaw clenched, fighting to maintain composure. The intelligence gathered at Site Omega during October 1962, Winters continued, provided crucial tracking data on Soviet submarine movements. This intelligence was forwarded to Naval Command and contributed directly to the strategic decisions that helped resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis peacefully. In the assessment of military historians and intelligence analysts, Preston Ashford's work helped prevent nuclear war. The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical presence. Helped prevent nuclear war. Not might have, not possibly, but helped prevent. Official confirmation of what Trent had suspected, what Dr. Stokes had theorized, what Lenora and Preston Jr. had hoped was true. "Today," Winters said, "the Department of Defense formally acknowledges Preston Ashford's service and sacrifice. We honor his memory and his contribution to national security. And we extend our deepest gratitude to his family, who bore the cost of his secrecy without understanding why." He stepped away from the podium and approached Lenora. In his hands was a framed certificate, the official acknowledgement of Preston Ashford's service, signed by the Secretary of Defense and bearing the seal of the United States government. "On behalf of a grateful nation," Winters said, presenting the certificate to Lenora, "thank you. Your father's service mattered. His sacrifice was not in vain. And his story will now be part of the official historical record." Lenora accepted the certificate with shaking hands. Preston Jr. stood and placed a hand on his sister's shoulder. For a moment, the two siblings simply stood there, holding their father's official recognition, tears streaming down both their faces. Then Winters did something unexpected. He turned to Trent. "Mr. Halloran, please stand." Trent rose awkwardly, unsure what was happening. "Without your dedication to historical preservation," Winters said, "without your refusal to treat these materials as trash, without your commitment to telling Preston Ashford's story with dignity and respect, none of this would have been possible. The Department of Defense recognizes that civilians play a crucial role in preserving military history. Your contribution to that preservation is noteworthy and appreciated." He handed Trent a smaller certificate, a commendation for historical preservation, signed by military historians and archivists. It wasn't a military honor, but it was official recognition from the government. "Thank you for finding our forgotten heroes," Winters said quietly, "and thank you for refusing to let them stay forgotten." The ceremony continued with remarks from other officials, a presentation about the Cold War listening network, and the official transfer of declassified Site Omega materials to the National Archives, but Trent barely heard any of it. He was holding a certificate that said his work mattered, that his choice to care about history had been the right one. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjacent room. Military personnel approached Lenora and Preston Jr. to share their own stories of classified service. Historians spoke with Dr. Stokes about research opportunities, and Trent found himself in conversation with veterans who'd served in similar circumstances, intelligence work that couldn't be discussed, sacrifices that went unacknowledged, families who'd never understood. "My wife thought I was having an affair," one retired Air Force officer said. "I was actually running a listening post in Alaska, but I couldn't tell her. We divorced before I could explain. By the time the work was declassified, it was too late to fix what had been broken." Another veteran nodded. "My kids grew up thinking I didn't care about them. I missed everything, birthdays, graduations, their weddings, because of operational demands I couldn't explain. They still don't talk to me. Even now that the truth is out, some damage can't be undone." Trent listened to their stories with a heavy heart. Preston Ashford's tragedy wasn't unique. It was repeated dozens, maybe hundreds of times across the country. Men and women who'd served in silence and paid with their families, their marriages, their relationships. But Preston's story had been told, his service had been acknowledged, his children had received closure. That was something. It wasn't enough to undo the pain, but it was something. Lenora found him near the end of the reception. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this. For making sure my father's story was told properly, for treating his service with respect, for she gestured to the hall, the ceremony, everything, for caring when you didn't have to." "I had to," Trent said. "Once I read his journals, once I understood what he'd sacrificed, I couldn't just throw it away. He deserved better than a landfill. He deserved better than a lot of things," Lenora said. "But at least now he has this recognition, honor, memory. That's more than we had 3 months ago." Preston Jr. joined them, still carrying the framed certificate. "We've been talking," he said, "Lenora and I, about the Memorial Fund, about the restoration project, about everything you've accomplished. We want to make sure you know how much it means. Not just to us, but to everyone whose families were affected by classified service." "It's not finished," Trent said. "There's more work to do, more stories to find, more forgotten heroes to remember." "Then let's keep working," Preston Jr. said, "together." They shook hands, and Trent felt the connection not just between him and the Ashford family, but between past and present, between forgotten history and preserved memory, between service rendered and service acknowledged. The flight back to Oregon the next day felt different than the flight out. Trent carried his commendation certificate in his bag, but more importantly, he carried the knowledge that Preston Ashford's story was now officially part of history. It would be taught in schools, referenced in books, remembered by future generations. A man who died alone and unacknowledged would now be remembered as a hero. As the plane descended toward Portland, Trent looked out the window at the landscape below: green forests, snow-capped mountains, rivers cutting through valleys. Preston Ashford had worked to protect this, had sacrificed his family to keep this safe. And now, finally, that sacrifice was recognized. Cassidy dozed in the seat beside him, her head resting against the window. She'd taken time off work to be there with him, to witness history being corrected. His daughter, who'd barely spoken to him a year ago, now choosing to be present for the important moments in his life. Everything had changed because of a $20 cleanup job, because of a torn trash bag and a decision not to throw history away. Because Trent had chosen to care about something beyond his own survival. The plane touched down, and Trent gathered his things. Tomorrow he'd go back to work on the mansion restoration. He'd continue organizing materials for the book, consulting on the documentary, responding to letters from families seeking their own forgotten stories. But tonight, he'd have dinner with Cassidy. They'd talk about the ceremony, about her new job, about the life they were rebuilding together. And that mattered just as much as any Pentagon ceremony. Preston Ashford's watch kept steady time on his wrist, time spent in service of what matters most. Trent was learning to spend his time wisely, balancing historical preservation with personal connection, honoring the past while building a future. It was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Clement Springs with the kind of gentle insistence that made people remember why they stayed in Oregon despite the long winters. The Ashford Mansion project was nearing completion, and the town had planned a grand opening for the historical site on the first Saturday in May. Trent stood in the restored attic, now transformed into a museum exhibit that somehow managed to be both educational and deeply personal. The radio equipment sat on the original desk, authentically restored to working condition. Display cases held Preston Ashford's journals, carefully preserved behind glass. Photographs lined the walls: the family in happier times, the Site Omega crew, Preston in his uniform. But the most powerful element was something Lenora had suggested. In the corner where Preston's desk had sat, they'd created a small vignette, a child's drawing of a family with an empty chair, a letter from Vivian asking where her husband was, and a page from Preston's journal expressing his regret. Side by side, they told the human cost of classified service. "It's perfect," Faye said, walking through the space with the reverence of someone who understood what they'd accomplished. "People won't just learn about Cold War intelligence. They'll understand what it cost." The grand opening drew a crowd that exceeded everyone's expectations. Over 300 people filled the mansion and its grounds: veterans, historians, families affected by classified service, community members who'd watched the transformation from abandoned ruin to historic landmark. News crews from Portland and Seattle set up cameras on the front lawn. Trent had been asked to speak, along with Lenora and Dr. Stokes. He'd prepared remarks, but found himself setting them aside when he reached the podium. 5 months ago, he began, "I was a 58-year-old handyman who took a $20 job because I needed $20. I had no idea that cleaning out an attic would change my life, would restore a family's understanding of their father, would preserve an important piece of American history." He paused, looking out at the crowd. Cassidy and Warren were there together, his daughter having driven up from Portland that morning. Hal stood with Faye, both of them beaming with pride. Lenora and Preston Jr. occupied seats of honor in the front row. Preston Ashford served his country in silence and paid for that service with his family. His story was almost lost forever, buried in trash bags and forgotten in an abandoned attic. But today, we remember him. We honor his sacrifice, and we commit to ensuring that other stories like his aren't lost to time. He gestured to the mansion behind him. "This building is more than a museum. It's a reminder that history happens in ordinary places, that heroes aren't always obvious, and that the work of preservation matters. Every document we save, every story we tell, every forgotten life we remember, that's the work of keeping our collective memory intact. The applause was warm and sustained. Lenora spoke next, sharing personal memories of her father, tempered now with understanding. Dr. Stokes provided historical context. And then the crowd was invited inside for tours of the restored mansion. Trent found himself in the attic, surrounded by visitors asking questions, sharing their own family stories of classified service, thanking him for the work he'd done. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. Late in the afternoon, as the crowds began to thin, Warren found him sitting on the mansion's front steps, taking a moment of quiet. "This is really something, Dad," Warren said, sitting down beside him. "What you've built here. A lot of people helped," Trent said. "But you started it. You recognized that what you found mattered." Warren was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. About recognizing what matters. About not throwing away things that are valuable just because they seem ordinary or damaged or hard to deal with." Trent looked at his son, seeing the subtext beneath the words. "Are we still talking about historical preservation?" "Maybe not entirely." Warren smiled slightly. "You and we've been pretty damaged for a while, but we're not beyond repair. Just like this house wasn't beyond repair. Just take someone willing to do the work." "I'm willing," Trent said. "I know. That's what I'm learning." Warren stood, offering his hand to help Trent up. "Come on. Cassidy's trying to organize dinner for all of us, including Hal and the Ashfords. Apparently she's decided we're all family now." They walked back inside. Together, Trent's hand on his son's shoulder. Through the mansion's windows, he could see the town of Clement Springs stretching out below, the setting sun painting everything in gold. 5 months ago, he'd been desperate and alone, down to his last $20 and his last shreds of hope. Today, he was surrounded by family and friends, engaged in meaningful work, part of something larger than himself. Preston Ashford's watch ticked steadily on his wrist, and Trent understood its message more clearly than ever. Time spent in service of what matters most, not just history, not just duty, but connection, love, presence. The difficult, beautiful work of showing up for the people and causes that give life meaning. He'd found that purpose in an attic filled with trash bags. And in finding it, he'd found himself again. The mansion stood solid behind them, its restoration complete, its story finally told. And Trent Halloran, once lost and now found, walked inside to join his family for dinner. Some discoveries he'd learned change everything. 6 months later, on a crisp November morning, Trent Halloran sat at the desk in his new office at the Preston Ashford Memorial Fund headquarters, a modest space on Main Street that had once housed a hardware store. The building had good bones, as his father would have said, and Trent had helped with the renovation himself, unable to fully leave carpentry behind. His role as fund director had evolved into something more meaningful than he'd imagined. The fund now supported historical preservation projects across the Pacific Northwest, focusing on finding and telling the stories of forgotten service members. 3 new sites had been identified, each with its own buried history waiting to be uncovered. But this morning wasn't about work. Trent was writing in the journal he'd started the night of the press conference, the one he intended to leave for his grandchildren someday. The pages had filled quickly with reflections, memories, and lessons learned from a year that had transformed everything. He wrote, "Asterisk. A year ago, I was down to my last $20 and my last bit of hope. I thought my life was over, not in the dramatic sense of ending, but in the quiet sense of no longer mattering. I'd lost Maureen, lost my business, lost my connection to my children. I was just existing, waiting for time to pass." Asterisk. His phone buzzed with a text from Cassidy. Asterisk, leaving Portland now. Should be there by noon. Warren's flight lands at 1. Still good for 2 p.m. Asterisk. Trent smiled and replied, Asterisk. Perfect. Turkeys in the oven. Asterisk. Today was Thanksgiving, the first holiday in 6 years that would include both his children. Cassidy had driven up from Portland, where she was thriving in her new position. Warren had taken time off from work and flown in from Seattle, where he'd recently relocated for a job opportunity. And they'd both be staying through the weekend, sleeping in the guest rooms of Trent's new 2-bedroom house, modest but comfortable, purchased with advances from the book deal and consulting fees. The house sat on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the mansion and walking distance from Mabel's diner. It had a small yard where Trent was learning to garden, following advice from Hal, who'd become something between a friend and a father figure over the past year. Trent returned to his journal. Asterisk. I've learned that purpose doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it comes wrapped in trash bags, hidden in attics, buried under decades of dust and neglect. And sometimes finding purpose isn't about discovering something new, but about recognizing value in what others have overlooked. Asterisk. He thought about Preston Ashford, about the parallel journeys they'd taken, decades apart. Both men who'd lost their way, though for different reasons. Preston had been consumed by classified duty. Trent had been consumed by grief. Both had paid with their families. But Preston never got the chance to make amends, to rebuild what had been broken. Trent had that chance, and he was taking it. The journal entry continued. Asterisk. Preston Ashford taught me that service matters, but not at the expense of everything else. His tragedy was believing he had to choose between duty and family. My mistake was thinking grief excused me from showing up for the people who needed me. We were both wrong in different ways. Asterisk. At noon, Cassidy arrived with bags of groceries and stories from work. At 1, Trent picked up Warren from the small regional airport, and his son talked enthusiastically about his new job during the drive back. By 2, they were all in Trent's kitchen, Cassidy making her mother's famous stuffing recipe, Warren setting the table, Trent basting the turkey, and trying not to get emotional about having them both there. Hal joined them at 3, bringing homemade pumpkin pie. The 4 of them sat around Trent's dining table, the one he'd built himself from reclaimed wood, salvaged during the mansion restoration, and for a moment, before the meal began, Trent just looked at them. His children laughing together over some shared memory. Hal, who'd given him the $20 job that changed everything. The life he'd rebuilt from nothing, one choice at a time. I want to say something, Trent said, and the table grew quiet. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined this. Having you both here, having purpose in my life again, feeling like I matter, and it all started because I decided not to throw away someone else's story. He raised his glass. To Preston Ashford, who taught me that it's never too late to recognize what's valuable, and to second chances, for those lucky enough to get them. They clinked glasses, and the conversation resumed. Outside, Clement Springs was settling into autumn evening, the streetlights coming on, the town peaceful and quiet. Inside, Trent Halloran was exactly where he needed to be. After dinner, as Cassidy and Warren washed dishes and argued amiably about whose turn it was to dry, Trent stepped onto his small front porch. Preston Ashford's watch showed 7:30. He'd worn it every day since Lenora gave it to him, a reminder of time's value and how to spend it wisely. His phone was in his pocket, but he didn't reach for it. He just stood there, breathing cold air, feeling contentment settle over him like a familiar coat. Tomorrow he'd go back to work at the fund, continue the mission of finding forgotten stories. Next week he'd meet with the documentary crew for final interviews. Next month would bring the book's publication and all the attention that would follow. But tonight was for gratitude, for family, for the quiet recognition that sometimes hitting bottom reveals the foundation on which to rebuild. Trent looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky and thought about a man he'd never met but had come to understand deeply. Preston Ashford had served his country and lost his family. Trent had found Preston's story and, in the process, found his family again. It wasn't a perfect ending. Life rarely offered those. But it was a good one, earned through choices made and work done, and the refusal to give up even when everything seemed lost. Inside, he heard Cassidy laugh at something Warren said, and Hal's deeper voice joining in. His family, not by blood alone, but by the bonds of showing up, of being present, of doing the hard work of connection. Trent smiled and walked back inside, closing the door on the cold night and stepping into warmth. Some treasures are found in attics, others are rebuilt from the pieces that remain. Both are worth the effort.